Welcome. We're glad you're here this morning. We're in our second week of Advent. We're talking about peace this morning. Last week we were looking at hope, although sometimes it sounded a lot like we were talking about peace. This week we're talking about peace, but there's an element of hope involved in that. And we're looking at Isaiah 11, 1 through 10. And I have a couple goals as we go through Isaiah 11. And we're not really going through the whole thing. I mean, we're going to see the full picture that it gives. We're going to probably be a little more heavy on the front this morning. But I want to look, as we look at Isaiah 11, I want to look at the historical context that Isaiah finds himself in. We looked at that a little last week, and from what I heard, nobody fell asleep during that section, so that's good. You're doing good. Don't do it this week either. It's relevant to understand the historical setting of Isaiah 11. We can't ignore it. Now, the other thing, though, the other goal I have is that I want to also look beyond the immediate historical context of Isaiah 11. What does it really mean for us as we translate it today? And there's more than meets the eye in the text, and we can't ignore that either. And as I said last week, there are kind of two tendencies when you come to texts in Isaiah that I find, especially as we get into Advent, we're talking Christmas, and the Messianic prophecies. There are a number of people who want to sit only in the days before Christ and say that's where Isaiah belongs, right? And you find that a little bit more in the scholarly stuff when you read commentaries and things like that. It really doesn't have a lot to do with Jesus. People kind of made it that way. And then there are people that lean entirely and exclusively on, well, it has to do everything with Jesus. I don't want to ignore the historical context, but it has a lot to do with Jesus. It launches us that way. We can't ignore that. That's clearly where it's going. So let's look a little bit at history today, and then we'll move to today. We talked last week, there were 4 kings in the the prophetic sort of career of Isaiah. And if you remember, Isaiah was in the southern kingdom. Israel had been divided into 2. There's the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem is, and that's where Isaiah worked. And if you were to read in 2 Chronicles 28, we'll just read a little bit of it. It should come up on the screen. We'll read about King Ahaz. Isaiah 11 has a lot to do with what King Ahaz did. And we read in 2 Chronicles, it says, Ahaz was 28 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel and made idols for worshiping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. Therefore the Lord his God delivered him into the hands of the king of Aram. The Arameans defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners and brought them to Damascus. So if you remember the history, if you were here last week, what happens is that Assyria, and I hope our map comes up. There you go. Assyria, I added to it this week. Assyria is the rising superpower, and we heard it mentioned in this passage, Aram, we'll call it Damascus today. Damascus and Israel, that northern kingdom, decide to form an alliance because they see this big giant neighbor that's conquering everybody else, and the Assyrians are really rather unfriendly about it anyways. They're pretty mean. And so they try to form an alliance with Judah. And Judah says, no way, we don't want a part of that. So then Damascus and Israel, well, they set off to conquer Judah. Instead, they said, well, if you won't join us, we're going to attack you. So they attack with help from the Philistines and the Edomites and other people. There's lots of capturing, pillaging, and destruction that goes on in Judah over a long period of time here. And King Ahaz, despite the advice against it, calls on the ruler of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III, and says, hey, come help. Attack these other guys because they're attacking us, and we'll make our alliance with you. And at the end of the day, Tiglath-Pileser III is only too happy to attack everybody, and he does, and he conquers. And when it's all done and the dust settles, you have a lot of people around Judah that are conquered, and you have Judah themselves who are really under the thumb of Assyria because they now have to pay tribute. We'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. So everything stands in ruins in so many ways in Judah. And then we get to this text in Isaiah 11. And what do we read? It says, and you should have it open. I'm not going to put it up there. We heard it this morning. There's a stump of Jesse we read about. A root or a branch is going to come out of the stump of Jesse. And the first thing that I want to ask the question of is, why the stump of Jesse? I mean, what does that have to do with anything? Why not the tree of Jesse, if nothing else? And that's why the history is important, right? It seems like they're in a hopeless situation here. Judah is pretty well destroyed. Israel, Damascus, the Philistines, the Edomites, now the Assyrians have all conquered and or destroyed the place. Judah is no longer independent. They're under the thumb of the Assyrians. They pay tribute to them. Ahaz even gives Tiglath-Pileser III, this ruler of Assyria, stuff from the temple to pay this tribute. And then he, besides that, orders that sacrifices be given to the gods of Damascus because, well, they conquered us. They must have some pretty powerful gods. And so the imagery becomes pretty simple then. It's the stump. If Judah was a tree before, what are they now? They're nothing but a stump. That's where they're at. And a stump is a nuisance, right? It's not a source of beauty or of shade. You can't climb a stump very easily. You can't do much with it. You can sit and think, and then it will rot. So then the next question, of course, we got the stump figured out. Who's Jesse then? Jesse was the father of King David. And I find it very interesting. This imagery is so fascinating. Why Jesse and not David? The stump of David would make sense, wouldn't it? It even mentions that in 2 Chronicles when we read about that moment. But he was the king. David was. Jesse wasn't the king. Jesse was his dad, a shepherd. Not a king by any means. John Calvin says something very interesting about this, the scholar from the Reformation. In his commentary on Isaiah, he says, Isaiah does not call him David, he's talking about this passage, but Jesse, because the rank of that family had sunk so low that it appeared to be not a royal family, but that of a mean peasant, such as the family of Jesse was. See, Ahaz had been told not to ally with the king of Assyria, and yet he did. Isaiah told him, don't do that. Ahaz was disobedient. He worshipped other gods. He ordered that altars be set up all around Judah. He's giving away the stuff from the temple, and he goes down in history as if not the worst, one of the worst kings of both Israel and Judah, and there's a pretty good list of worst kings, so it's pretty bad to be one of the worst. With all his faults yet, King David, one of those three kings early on, had been called a man after God's own heart. Even though he had a lot of issues, he had a lot of faults, he's called a man after God's own heart. Ahaz and Judah in his time don't even come close to the days of David, when there was a unified Israel. Ahaz was disobedient and idol-chasing, conquered king. He's not even in the same ballpark as David. That's what Calvin is saying. That's what the text is saying. It doesn't even deserve to be called the stump of David. It's the stump of Jesse. It doesn't even rise to that level. Maybe that's unfair to Jesse, but that's how they say it in Isaiah. The next thing is the branch that comes out of the stump. In 2 Kings 16, we read a little bit more about this history. It's pieced together from different texts in the Old Testament. This is where we learn about Ahaz asking the king of Assyria to help. He says, Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel who are attacking me. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. Then he deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin, that's the king of Aram, to death. So you experience this. Imagine then that you're from Judah. Kings are dying, not your own. People are being conquered and deported. Again, not your own people, but your king himself is even selling out to everybody else around, whoever seems to be the strongest at the time, even potential conquerors, or conquerors, as it were. And you're now the people under the thumb of a power-hungry nation. This is not your time of greatest security, is it? Things would feel very insecure. In fact, where's your hope at this time? This seems so far off from the optimism in the days of King David that they're looking back to. And really, for all you know, your king may die soon. If there's any hope for David's family line, it's dying with each king. It's getting worse and worse along the way. And now we read, hope is springing forth. Something's going to come out of the destruction that is Judah. And that's powerful if you're living in that time, isn't it? There's some hope there. I don't know about you, but the stump concept, I mean, I've been around stumps that are rotting, but sometimes there are stumps that grow a branch. Have you seen this? And I like to plant things, and we've tried to take out bushes and things like that before. We're in places we've lived, and you cut off the bush, and you're trying to get rid of it, and it just grows back up, right? Some plants are persistent. This plant is persistent. This thing will keep growing. Now, it's not going to look like much when that branch keeps coming up, but God leaves a remnant. That comes up in Isaiah. He promised. He said, I'm going to stick with you guys. There's going to be a branch. There's going to be something that comes out of these ruins. I'm not going to tolerate just any behavior, is what God's saying. So you can't just get away with anything, but I'm not going to leave you. I made promises to you. I'm going to uphold those, and I'll rescue you. The next thing I think that's interesting that we read out of the text is about this branch. This branch, it says, the Spirit of the Lord, if you go to verse 2, will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He's going to delight in the fear of the Lord. Fear appears to be closely associated or related to knowledge here. We'll kind of get to some of that in the application. But from the text, we can see that this relates to the child or the branch that we're talking about and how he's going to interact with the world. I think this is just powerful imagery. He's going to judge with righteousness, not by sight. And he's going to judge, make his decisions with justice, not by what he hears. And he's actually going to have power to do it, which is pretty amazing considering the context that you hear this in. Verse 4 says, he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. That's pretty powerful. I mean, right now the rod is Assyria, but this guy can do it with the breath of his lips. If you think of the context in Isaiah's day, then the only person who has power is that conquering country of Assyria. And they're not conquering for righteous reasons, are they? They're conquering for their own purposes. Even if we limit to intent, not just power, what's going on, let's say the intent of Judah or of any of the kings of the time, Assyria, none of them are ruling with righteousness from what we can see. None of them are worried about justice. They don't have the intent of that, let alone the power to do it, even if they had the intent. They're completely stripped of all of that. There's such little power in Judah, in fact, that they're calling on other gods to see if maybe they can get some power from them, the gods of their masters. But this branch is going to have power to do all this, not just the intent to do it, to judge and decide. And the branch from Jesse is going to be what God intended for his people. Judah is, in Isaiah's day, the complete opposite of this ideal now. They've turned away, they're destroyed. Judah is unprepared to come close to this ideal, but the branch from Jesse, he's going to be ready and moving in pursuit of this ideal from the start. Verse 5 says, righteousness will be his belt, faithfulness the sash around his waist. When you're ready to run in Isaiah's day or to get into action, whether it's battle or whatever, you have to tie up your loose clothing into your belt. Just like if you watch a kid running with a backpack and they've got a sweatshirt on the back, right? There's stuff flying all around. It's hard to run. Same thing. If you want action, or if you're going to get into action, you've got to tie up the loose clothing. That's what this means. He's ready to go, and he can. Finally, peace. Peace is pictured in this text, although I don't see the word peace. Maybe you do. I didn't see it. Our text doesn't seem to use it, but it does show a picture of peace, doesn't it? The wolf and the lamb are lying together. The leopard and the goat, the cow and the bear, they're hanging out together. The lion is eating straw, and babies are playing with poisonous snakes. This is quite a picture, isn't it? All of a sudden, there's no enmity between all the animals. And it says, they will neither harm nor destroy. This is verse 9. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. It's a really interesting picture that we get to, isn't it? If you notice, the branch from Jesse is judging and deciding for the human contingent. I found this interesting. The animals seem to show us what this all looks like, what the peace will look like. God's not judging the animals. They're showing us. When the judgment occurs, everyone's going to be able to look around and say, wow, this is what it's supposed to be like. This is the peace. And a little child will lead them. That's how peaceful and compliant they'll be. The nations are going to rally and gather together under the banner of God's peace. And I want to note, we read this last week, this same concept that there's this peace going out, we read last week. Here, everybody's gathering together, the nations are. Don't hear from that any sense of universalism that everybody's it's all going to be bygones, whatever it is. If you didn't come to Jesus, you can come. No, you have to choose that still. That's not what it's saying. And we'll see some of that in Isaiah 35 next week. But this is a powerful picture, isn't it, of peace, of everybody, no more enmity and no more problems between people trying to eat each other, animals trying to eat each other. And this concept of peace seems so foreign to us, doesn't it? It's almost unbelievable. How is this going to happen? I'm not going to go let my kid play around a poisonous snake anytime soon. So we read about peace like this. I mean, we're in a world where it's easier to pick a fight than to find lasting peace, isn't it? And yet we read this text. And we can have peace where, yes, we can play with those snakes. Yes, you can have a lion for a pet and it's not going to eat you. And that's the picture of peace. And a little child's going to lead him, and it seems wild and nutty to me that this could happen if you just think about it the way it is. But it should seem that way. That's kind of the idea, because whether you lived in Isaiah's day or our day, this just seems far-fetched. It's a wonderful ideal, but how could we ever get there? Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann points out that's the only way that a peace like this could really be portrayed. I like what he says. He says it doesn't fit any category we have of peace. It couldn't. It breaks the mold. And within the upheaval of the world around Jerusalem and Judah, this category of peace is one that can only be met by God. That's why it's got to be so unbelievable. No earthly king could ever achieve this or come close. It's only God. Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, says the chance for peace rests in the trustworthiness of God and the issue of God keeping faith with God's promises. It's only because he has committed to do this, and he will do it, and he's faithful. It's no earthly king who can fulfill this. It's only God. Like I said, we're not going through the whole of the text, piecing it apart. Maybe I pieced apart a lot of it for you. But let's look at what this does for us today. I found this fun, but hard in some ways, because there's some very specific moments, but there's some very vague moments about this whole thing. So stick with me here. As we apply this, the things I see that come out of the text are, first of all, that we should fear the Lord. Now, that's a pretty general statement, isn't it? Fear the Lord. You could probably find that in a lot of texts to apply. But this child, this root of Jesse, this branch that comes off the tree, will fear the Lord, we read. If you go back to verse 2, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. And he's going to delight in the fear of the Lord, it says in verse 3. And then I thought about this week. Can you passively fear the Lord, I wondered. See, the fear of the Lord, I think, requires action. And I think when you look at the text, that's what the branch is doing. It requires action. The fear of the Lord is found, I think, in our decisions and the way that we conduct our lives, the choices we make. So you can't really be passive. Whenever you're passive, you're still making choices, but you're not necessarily fearing the Lord. The world that Isaiah's people live in, that we find the people of Judah, of Ahaz ruling, is the world where the king is selling out to the highest bidder. The most powerful earthly power, the one who's going to pay or protect or do whatever. He's not fearing the Lord. He's doing what's most convenient. You'll know if you're fearing the Lord by your actions. King Ahaz did not do that in a very literal sense. He didn't fear the Lord. And because he did that, his actions proved that he didn't regard God as the only God. He's selling out all over the place. It's no different, I think, with our own actions. What we decide to do signals our level of fear, right? King Ahaz had a different kind of fear. He had a fear for his life. Fear in this case has to do with loyalty. It has to do with faithfulness, and it has to do with belief. The loyalty is that God is the only God and there is no other. Faithfulness is the fact that he's going to be loyal to us as well and stand by his promises. And then the belief is the fact that he actually has the power to do what he says. We believe that. So our decision to reflect fear of God comes from reflecting our belief about these things, that God will stand by me, I need to stand by him, and God will do what he says. And I need to make my decisions believing that God will do what he says. The next thing I see from the text is that fear, I said, is closely related to knowledge of the Lord. We need to find the knowledge of the Lord. Clearly, God does things in a different manner than people. I don't know if that's your experience. That's mine. The only way the branch of Jesse will succeed in this ultimate goal of peace is by the Spirit. That's pretty clear in the text. We judge by what we see and hear. Branch, and I take that to be Jesus. The branch of Jesse will do things by righteousness and with justice. The only way I think we can truly find the knowledge of the Lord is the same way the branch does, by the Spirit. The Spirit needs to rest on you as well. And if you can't allow for that, then you really can't find the knowledge of the Lord. Many people have knowledge of God, right? But that distinguishing factor is belief. Fearing God, we talked about that. I think that has a good emphasis on intent. I think the knowledge part of the Lord has more to do with pursuit than be in pursuit of the knowledge of the Lord. And we can expect, or we shouldn't expect, a different path that will work than the one that the branch takes. If the branch from Jesse takes this path, that the Spirit will be on him and then he'll have the knowledge of the Lord because he fears the Lord, then why would we expect any alternative could work? And yet we can do that, can't we? We'll try and pursue the same goal, but maybe through other means sometimes. We'll lack the belief sometimes that God will stand by us or that God can follow through. I mean, how often I find myself there regularly. I trust you, God, in so many ways, but then there are these areas where it's easy to not trust. I still do wrong. I still make decisions without relying on God constantly. And somebody could challenge me and say, well, would God bless what you said, what you did? And those are the kinds of things that we need to be challenged with. We have to say no at times. No, I'm not really finding my knowledge in the fear of the Lord. That Spirit has to rest on us, and we have to believe then that God really will be with us if we want to walk in the knowledge of the Lord. So we need to have fear in place if we want to do that. If our intent is to follow God based on who he is, we need to believe that God can set his Spirit on us and in fact guide us, and then we need to rely on that. And then there's a third thing the text talks about, which is pursuing the path of peace, which the other two lead you towards. But as far as I can tell from the text, there's that issue of helping in the effort to rally the nations. We heard about some of this last week as well. Many parts of this message could, in fact, have been used last week or might sound similar to last week. Because of that, we focused on hope. It got tied up really a lot in peace last week. And there was clearly a sort of evangelistic side to that message. The nations need to hear about the hope that's coming, we heard last week. It's going to go out from Zion to the rest of the world. And we need to be part of that source of hope for all. But the hopeful message needs to be delivered to everybody. This week we're focused on peace. And again, we run into the nations rallying under the banner, which means they're all coming together under essentially God's army. That's the kind of imagery that it's talking about. Peace has come at that point. Peace can be found there in the end. But the thing is, and I think the Advent reading said this well, and the text says this, peace can be found at the end of all things, but peace can be found even now, because that's where the text is going, to Jesus the Messiah, the one who can, in fact, save us and give us peace even now. The truth is the branch grew, right? We had Jesus. Jesus came, and we celebrate that as a historical event, but even as a real event now that Jesus offers that peace to us. And I'll say this, if you're in need of that peace, let's talk. The branch has grown. We can have a part of that. And if you already know that peace, we're the messengers. We're supposed to take it out. We're supposed to rally under the banner and take it with us. I'm giving that a spin for now and for later. It's a hard text, I think. People want to interpret that in a lot of different ways. I'm interpreting it in a lot of different ways all of a sudden. But we live in peace, offered even now, if we find that in Jesus Christ. But I want to say this. We know that that's not a full reality yet. There's a to come about this. We can have peace now. But I would caution you, don't stick your hand in the viper's nest just yet, right? I remember being in Jerusalem back in 2000. I went into a store, and in fact, the man had a viper there. He had it in a rather small cookie jar, and he said, "You want to hold the snake?" And I said, "No, I don't think I do." "What kind of snake is that?" "I don't know. Got it from Egypt." "All right, I definitely don't want to hold that snake." I've looked it up since. It was a viper. Don't stick your hand in the viper's nest just yet. The peace is coming. We need to help bring that peace and deliver the message of peace. Part of the peace is here. That's the beautiful thing about it, and we can have a part of that, but we need to deliver the peace as well. And so we read in Isaiah a message relevant for now as it was then. Fear the Lord, find the knowledge of the Lord, pursue peace. Peace even now. And the great deceit is that we can be deceived into thinking that lasting peace could come through other means. It can't. It's Jesus. That's it. We can be deceived that people can bring salvation in other ways, in different kinds of lasting ways. It can't. I can't give you real peace, but I can tell you how to get it. We're given a picture of peace in Isaiah 11. Peace that was brought in the manger in Bethlehem. Peace that was found through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Peace that can be found today because of the work of Jesus Christ. And peace that's going to be beyond our wildest dreams when that day finally comes and Jesus returns. That final redemption. That's the peace that we're given through Jesus Christ that Isaiah talks about. Let's pray together. Father, we love you. Thank you for delivering peace. Even in the midst of hopelessness, in the midst of leaders who were unfaithful, in the midst of a world that was absolutely destroyed, when it looked like everything could go wrong and it already had, and everything could just be done. God, you delivered peace in the worst of times, in the midst of division and strife, death and destruction. And God, thank you that you delivered peace. And you deliver it to us even today when we find ourselves in strife and in division. Whether problems personally at home, whether problems with our family and friends, with work, God, you can deliver peace to us in a real way. Thank you for that. I pray this all in the name of your Son. Amen.